I'm going to share with you today the ugly truth about yogurt. But before I kind of dive into the yogurt, there's one really important concept that you need to know about consuming cultured or fermented products, especially yogurt. When you consume yogurt, you might think that that bacteria is going to go into your large intestine and start to build it back up. They call that reseeding. Well, the first thing you need to know is that is extremely, extremely rare. There's only a very few strains of bacteria that actually can go in there and reseed your gut. And those microbes that can reseed are rarely in any of your yogurt to start with. Number two, your gut is already densely populated with microbes, okay? And they're very territorial. They don't want anyone else to come into their space. They form this protective barrier called colonization-resistant barrier. And so the question is, what is the real benefit of yogurt and other fermented products if it's not to reseed the gut microbiome? Well, the real benefit is to change the environment, the pH, the level of oxygen, the food that they eat, and something called the metabolites. And they're basically a substance to allow them to survive a lot better in that environment. When you change the environment for the better for these microbes, you activate dormant microbes that are already there. They're microbes that have been suppressed by antibiotics, junk food, or whatever. You see, from birth, you've been given microbes from breast milk, hopefully if you were breastfed, and the food that you ate, all these microbes kind of came in there. And then maybe you had an antibiotic and you ate junk food, and then the time goes on, and a lot of these microbes have gone into this dormant state, and some of them have gotten into a spore state. Very similar to, like in the winter, I live on a farm, and the grass isn't growing in the winter, right? If you dig into the soil, like the microbes are either frozen or they're in a spore formation, but they're not necessarily alive in the winter because it's too cold. Then they're going to wait for that environment to be a lot better before they come out. So in other words, chances are you might have a lot of the good bacteria that you need already in your gut in a dormant state. So when you change the environment, they get reactivated. They start growing, they start to overtake the bad bacteria, and now you shifted the entire microbiome balance. And I really want you to understand that because the terrain, the soil, the environment is so important. It's even probably more important than the microbes. Because if you don't know that, you could be taking probiotics, you could be taking all this fermented food, but it doesn't really do anything because the environment is not good enough to allow them to live. A lot of the dormant microbes are what's called keystone microbes. They're the ones that kind of keep the bad guys in check, but they're usually dormant if the environment is not right. Now that you have that basic, let's talk about yogurt, okay? Most commercial yogurt, when you go in a grocery store, you look at all these yogurts, and rarely do you look at the ingredients, but if you did, you're going to be shocked. A couple points I want to make just about yogurt. Some of the yogurt has what's called post-pasteurization. They start with this pasteurized milk that's heated, that has no bacteria, and then they add the bacteria, and then they heat it again. So basically, you're eating the dead corpse of bacteria because it's been double pasteurized. So unless it says live and active cultures, it's been double pasteurized. That's one thing. Number two, if we compare fermentation to typical yogurt or yogurt that you would ferment at home, there's a huge difference, okay, in the fermentation time. And fermentation is where you're just putting microbes in something like milk and you're allowing it to eat and grow and become more concentrated. Well, typically the commercial yogurt ferments for 1 to 2 hours, whereas the traditional yogurts, you might do 8 to 12 hours to 24 hours to sometimes 36 hours. So you have this super concentrated probiotic. And so when you see at the label, it has so many billions or millions CFUs, it's kind of like little colonies of bacteria. And then they, instead of counting the individual bacteria, they'll kind of give an estimate of how much bacteria that's in there. And they made certain estimates that you need at least 100 million of those CFUs to create some type of an effect on the body. But the problem is maybe they start out with 100 million CFUs when they make it, but once it's shipped, it's sitting on the shelf, and by the time you buy it, the chances of you having those 100 million is less than winning the lottery, okay? You're going to have a lot less. In fact, there was a study that I saw in 2017 that tested yogurt in Europe after 6 weeks, and there basically was no viable bacteria left. So what kills the bacteria? Number one, the sugar, high fructose corn syrup, or modified food starch, which basically is hidden sugar. All of that sugar creates this severe dehydration to the bacteria. And then they add all sorts of pectin and gels and gar gum. They keep it kind of stuck in one place. It can't move. It can't really do anything. It can't get nutrition. So then it just dies. And that is because when you start making yogurt, it takes some time to actually have the yogurt thicken, right? And change all the proteins. Well, they're doing shortcuts. So with 1 or 2 hours, you're not going to have thick yogurt. So then you're going to have to make it thicker with all these different things to change the texture, like the modified food starch, or carrageenan, or polysorbate 80, which, by the way, these two things start to diminish that mucosal layer to the point where you can actually then get a problem with leaky gut and inflammation in your gut. So here you are thinking, I'm going to take something that's good for my gut when it's actually going to be harmful for your gut. And then what about the artificial sweeteners, right? Artificial sweeteners have been known to alter the gut microbiome. And also, if you read the ingredients, sometimes it'll say, contains bioengineered food ingredients. That's another name for GMO, which could potentially mean it has traces of that Roundup Ready glyphosate, which, by the way, it's been patented as an antibiotic. And if it's true that there's traces of an herbicide in there and you're taking this antibiotic, which is supposed to be a probiotic, that's not good. But I think it's really important the next time you buy yogurt to read the ingredients. I'm going to just read some ingredients of a very common yogurt that you would get at the store. First ingredient is cultured grade A reduced fat milk. Of course, they have to start with, reduced fat milk. They add strawberry in there, sugar, fructose, water, modified food starch, milk protein concentrate, modified cornstarch, kosher gelatin, natural flavors, agar-agar, which is another gum, carrageenan, carmine. Carmine is for coloring, and carmine comes from insects. And by the way, sometimes they'll promote a good source of vitamin D, but if you look up the amounts on it, you're talking about only 80 international units, okay? The tiniest amount of vitamin D that you could possibly imagine. So if you think about this, this is the $45 billion industry with yogurt, and the great majority of it is sweetened, and they add all these different things. It is nothing remotely close to traditional yogurt or cultured milk products that they've used in other countries, in Turkey, in Greece, in India, where they ferment this product a lot longer. The product doesn't have added sugar, and it has a lot more concentration of microbes because you fermented it. Now, let's just get back to the sugar. How much sugar is in a 4-ounce thing of yogurt? And it's 25 grams. Now, actually, I lied. There's actually 19 grams of actual sugar, but the rest is modified cornstarch, which actually is hidden sugar because it's going to turn into sugar. So it really is 25 grams of sugar. So this perception that it's a health food, it's actually, no, it's a junk food. And we give it to our kids and we put it into our lunches and we think it's healthy. You really have to realize all this other stuff is super, super unhealthy. And that sugar is going to feed the pathogens. You just need to be aware when you consume typical commercial yogurt, you are getting less microbes than probably the tap water that you're drinking. Is there a yogurt that is good to consume? And the answer is yes, but realize that your purpose should be the changing of the environment. So let's just first mention about probiotics. Probiotics do contain a lot more microbes than yogurt and other fermented products. And a lot of times these microbes are freeze-dried. So they're basically preserved in a way that they're in this spore formation. And then when they get into your body, they do tend to get down to the large intestine. And if you take them repetitively, they can reseed the gut. But if you just have a one-shot deal, maybe they'll spike up and then they go away. And simply because they're just a lot more concentrated, they're like 100 to 1,000 times more concentrated. So there's a lot of probiotics that are good that do tend to pass the stomach level, but also you got to look on the label to see if they can resist the stomach acids. And the next question is, what about kefir? What is kefir? Kefir is like yogurt. It's a little bit thinner. It's a little bit more sour, but kefir is a lot better than yogurt if you just compare them side by side. And I do both. I do a certain type of yogurt, like Bulgarian yogurt, and I also make my own yogurt, which I'm going to explain shortly. But I also have kefir, and kefir has a combination of bacteria and yeast, whereas yogurt only has the bacteria, only a few strains, maybe 2 or 3. But kefir has sometimes up to 50 strains. And so when you buy actual yogurt, you don't want all this stuff in there. Or find some yogurt that is from grass-fed cows or sheep or even a goat. You want whole milk, but you do not want it flavored. You don't want any sweetener in there. And you don't want any carrageenan or artificial sweeteners. The goal should be to change the environment in your gut with that yogurt and reactivate the microbes that are already there. Now, in your appendix and in other places in your gut, you do have a reserve of microbes that can reseed your gut when the environment is correct. Okay, so you do have different places where your body protects this reservoir of microbes and it's just waiting for the right environment. And yogurt can be one way to get it. Kefir could be another way. And of course, on top of that, you really got to change the diet. You want to clean up the diet. But let me tell you about another fermented product that'll take your gut to the next level, and that is sauerkraut. Don't get the stuff on the shelf that's pasteurized because it's heated. You're killing off the microbes. Let me tell you what's in this sauerkraut. There's a lot of what's called polyphenols in the cabbage itself. Polyphenols are literally one of the best foods for the gut microbiome. They love it. Also, you're going to get a lot of what's called postbiotics. So prebiotics are the fiber. That would be like cabbage. Probiotics are the actual microbes. And then you have postbiotics, which are all these additional things to support the environment and help that microbe survive better. You also have small chain fatty acids to feed the colon cells in there. Also, you have this chemical sulforaphane, which I've done videos on this. It's like an anti-cancer. And there's also a lot of organic acids like lactic acid to create this amazing environment in your gut so that those dormant suppressed microbes can come out of remission and start to do their job. Then you also have glutamine, which is another thing that your gut needs to heal. Glutamine is also in meat, but it's also in cabbage. But the really cool thing in sauerkraut is this other compound called S-methylmethionine. This is another name for vitamin U. And they named that after ulcers because cabbage has a unique factor to help with ulcers. It has the ability to help heal the lining of the colon, and it's highly anti-inflammatory. If you consume cabbage, okay, you're going to be getting this, but when you consume sauerkraut that's fermented, you get 3 times the concentration of this. One of the things that I recommend is to consume the juice of the sauerkraut. The juice is where you're going to be getting a lot of this minus the fiber. And if you consume regular amounts of sauerkraut or fermented vegetables or other things, you could actually keep these microbes seeded and growing for a lot longer period of time. I did a video on how to make something called a cultured L. reuteri microbe. And I did a whole video on this and it went viral and a lot of people are doing it all over the world and it's producing amazing results with increasing your oxytocin, which increases your ability to be social. It helps your muscle mass. It helps your mood. It helps lower stress. And to learn more about this and how to make it, I put this video up right here. Check it out right now.